Growing up, I always knew something was off in my family, but as a kid, you don't have the vocabulary to describe favoritism. You just feel it. My younger sister, Sophie, was the star, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I wasn't jealous, at least not at first, but it was impossible not to notice the glaring differences in how we were treated. One of my earliest memories of this was when I turned 7. My birthday party was just a small family dinner, complete with a store-bought cake that still had the plastic lid on it. I didn't mind. It was cake, after all, but 2 months later, Sophie's 4th birthday rolled around, and they turned it into a full-on spectacle. There was a bounce house, a magician, and even a petting zoo. I remember watching her hug a goat while surrounded by balloons and wondering why my birthday didn't feel that special. The favoritism wasn't always that obvious, but it was consistent. Sophie got the newest toys for no reason, while I had to save up my allowance to buy the things I wanted. One time, I spent months saving for a bike I'd been dreaming of. The day I finally bought it, I was over the moon, until Sophie threw a tantrum because she wanted one too. Instead of teaching her about patience or hard work, my parents bought her a brand new, better bike the very next day. Mine was blue and simple. Hers was bright pink with streamers and a basket. I stopped riding mine after that. It wasn't just about material things. My parents were there for Sophie in a way they weren't for me. They went at every one of her school recitals and cheered like she was on Broadway. When I had the lead in a school play in 4th grade, they showed up late because Sophie had complained about a headache earlier that evening. By the time they arrived, my big scene was over. I still remember standing in the wings, scanning the crowd for them, and feeling my stomach sink when I realized they weren't there. Academically, I excelled, but it was like shouting into a void. Straight A's, science fair trophies, debate team captain. It was all met with lukewarm responses, like, "That's nice, honey." Meanwhile, Sophie got AB on a math test once, and they threw her a pizza party to celebrate. I think that was the first time I really started to feel bitter. It wasn't just that they favored her. It was that they seemed to actively downplay anything I achieved, like they couldn't be bothered to care. By high school, I was throwing myself into every activity I could think of, desperate to get some kind of acknowledgement. I kept a perfect GPA, joined every club that would have me, and even got a scholarship to attend a summer program at Yale. When I told my parents, I thought, just maybe, this would be the moment they'd finally be proud of me. Instead, my dad shrugged and said, "Good for you. Don't let it go to your head." That same night, they spent hours helping Sophie pick out a dress for her junior prom. The worst part was that it wasn't just my parents who bought into the Sophie worship. Extended family seemed to follow their lead. At family gatherings, everyone gravitated toward her, showering her with compliments and questions about her life, while I quietly blended into the background. "Oh, Sophie, you're so talented," they'd gush. "What's new with you, Alex?" they'd ask me as an afterthought, right before turning back to her. By the time I left for college, I'd all but given up on trying to win their approval. Therapy helped me realize that their favoritism wasn't my fault, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I learned to validate myself, to take pride in my own accomplishments, even if they didn't. By the time I graduated with honors and landed a great job in tech, I thought I'd moved past it. But no amount of success seemed to change how they saw me, or, more accurately, how they didn't see me. It wasn't until my grandfather passed away and his will was read that everything came to a head. When my grandfather passed away, it hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't the warm, affectionate type. He was more the quiet observer who didn't say much but always seemed to know everything. He and I weren't especially close, but he had a way of making me feel seen, even when I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't know how much he'd actually been paying attention to my life until his will was read. It turned out he had divided his estate equally among his children and grandchildren. My share was significant, around $200,000. It felt surreal, like some cosmic acknowledgement of everything I'd worked for that my parents had ignored. For once, I felt like someone in my family had truly noticed me. My parents, however, didn't share my enthusiasm. At first, they seemed quiet about it, which I assumed was just grief. But a few days after the reading, they invited me over for dinner. I should have known something was up because they rarely invited me over unless they needed something. We sat down in the living room, and after some awkward small talk, my mom finally said, "We need to talk about the inheritance." My dad jumped in, explaining that they felt it was unfair for Sophie and I to receive the same amount. According to them, Sophie needed the money more because she was struggling. She was still living at home, working part-time at a boutique, and had no real plans for her future. Meanwhile, I had a steady job, my own apartment, and no immediate financial concerns. "You're doing so well," my mom said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You don't need the money as much as Sophie does. Don't you think it would be the right thing to help her out?" I was stunned. They weren't asking me to share some of my inheritance. They wanted me to give Sophie all of it. They painted it as though Grandpa had been unfair, that he hadn't understood how much Sophie needed the money. My dad even said, if he'd known her situation, he would have left her more. "We're just asking you to do what he would have wanted." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told them, as calmly as I could, that Grandpa had been very clear in how he divided his estate. He treated all his grandchildren equally, knowing exactly what he was doing. "It's not up to us to change that," I said. But they weren't having it. My mom started crying, saying I was tearing the family apart. My dad accused me of being selfish, bringing up every little thing they'd ever done for me, as if paying for my braces in middle school was equivalent to handing over my inheritance. They kept going, guilt-tripping me with lines like, "We've sacrificed so much for you, and this is how you repay us?" When I held my ground, my dad's tone shifted. He became colder, angrier. "If you won't do the right thing," he said, "then maybe we'll have to." I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but the conversation left me feeling sick. I knew they'd always favored Sophie, but this was on another level. The next morning, I got a call from Sophie. She sounded hesitant, like she didn't really want to be making the call. "Mom and Dad said you might give me your share," she said. "I mean, you don't have to or anything, but they think it would really help." I was so angry I could barely speak. "Did you know they were planning this?" I asked. She swore she didn't, but her indifference was clear. She didn't outright demand the money, but she didn't stand up for me either. "It's not really my business," she said. "They just want what's best for everyone." That was the moment I realized I was completely on my own in this. My parents weren't going to stop, and Sophie wasn't going to push back against them. I knew I needed backup, so I called Grandma. Grandma wasn't one to get involved in family drama, but when I explained what was happening, she was furious. She told me that years ago, my parents had tried to convince Grandpa to leave everything to Sophie. He flat out refused, she said. He believed in fairness, and he wasn't going to let them manipulate him. She also told me about a clause in the will that I hadn't known about. Apparently, Grandpa had anticipated this kind of behavior. He'd included a stipulation stating that anyone who tried to contest the inheritance would forfeit their share entirely. Armed with this information, I called my parents and told them to back off. At first, they denied everything, claiming I'd misunderstood their intentions. But when I mentioned the clause, their tone changed. My dad tried to justify their actions, saying they were only looking out for Sophie's future. "This isn't about us," he said. "It's about family." I stood firm, reminding them that Grandpa's wishes were clear and that they had no right to interfere. That's when my mom accused me of being heartless, saying, "Do you even care about your sister?" I couldn't hold back anymore. "Do you care about me?" I shot back. "Because it sure doesn't feel like it." The conversation ended with my dad threatening to cut me out of their lives entirely if I didn't reconsider. "Think about what you're doing," he said. "This family doesn't need more division." But I wasn't the one dividing us, they were. And for the first time in my life, I refused to let them make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. The fallout from that conversation was immediate. My dad wasn't bluffing when he said they'd cut me out. I didn't hear from either of my parents for weeks, which was honestly a relief. The constant guilt-tripping had been exhausting, and the silence gave me some breathing room. But that peace didn't last long. It started with a few pointed messages from extended family members. My aunt texted me, saying she'd heard I wasn't willing to help Sophie, and that it was disappointing given how much my parents had done for me. A cousin chimed in, asking, "Don't you feel bad leaving her with nothing?" It was clear my parents had been spreading their version of events, conveniently leaving out the part where they tried to take all of my inheritance. I tried explaining my side, but most of them didn't want to hear it. The ones who supported me, like Grandma and a couple of my cousins, were already in my corner. The rest were too entrenched in my parents' narrative to listen. "It's not about the money," one cousin said. "It's about family." That phrase was starting to feel like a weapon they used to control me. Then things escalated. My dad, still acting as the executor of Grandpa's will, decided to take matters into his own hands. One day, I got a call from my parents' lawyer. The lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, told me my dad had tried to reallocate my share of the inheritance to Sophie. "He claims it's in line with your grandfather's wishes," the lawyer said, "but the will is very clear. He doesn't have the authority to do this." I was furious. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was outright theft. I called my dad immediately, and the conversation turned into a shouting match. He tried to justify his actions, saying Grandpa would have wanted Sophie to be taken care of, and I was being selfish for not agreeing. I reminded him that Grandpa had made his wishes clear and included a clause to prevent exactly this kind of interference. "You're breaking the law," I said. "Do you even realize that?" "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "This is my family, and I'll do what's best for it." I hung up and immediately called Grandma. She was livid when I told her what had happened. "He has no right," she said. "Your grandfather would be rolling in his grave if he knew what they were trying to pull." Grandma wasted no time getting involved. She contacted the lawyer, as well as my dad's siblings, who were equally outraged. Together, they moved to have my dad removed as executor. It was a tense, drawn-out process, but eventually, the lawyer confirmed that my inheritance would be protected and distributed as Grandpa intended. Meanwhile, the rift in the family only deepened. My parents were furious that I had involved Grandma and my uncles. They accused me of airing family business and turning everyone against them. My mom called me, crying about how I was tearing the family apart. My dad sent me a scathing email saying I was no longer welcome in their home and that I should think long and hard about the consequences of my actions. Sophie, as usual, stayed on the sidelines. When I tried talking to her about it, she shrugged and said, "I didn't ask them to do any of this." It was frustrating, but I couldn't entirely blame her. Our parents had spent her whole life teaching her to rely on them, to the point where she didn't know how to push back. Still, I couldn't help wishing she'd speak up for me, just once. The tension came to a head at a family gathering a few weeks later. My aunt was hosting, and I knew my parents would be there, but I decided to go anyway. I wasn't going to let them scare me into staying away from the rest of my family. As soon as I walked in, I felt the tension in the room. My parents were sitting at the table, glaring at me, while some of the other relatives avoided eye contact entirely. At one point, my dad stood up and started addressing the room, as if he were giving a speech. "I think it's important for everyone to know what's really going on here," he said, glaring directly at me. "Some people in this family think money is more important than loyalty." I could feel my face getting hot, but I refused to back down. "You mean loyalty to you?" I said. "Because Grandpa didn't see it that way, did he?" The room went silent. My dad tried to respond, but before he could, Grandma stepped in. "Enough," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't about loyalty. This is about respecting your father's wishes, which you clearly haven't been doing." I'd never seen my dad look so stunned. Grandma wasn't usually one to confront him, but she wasn't holding back this time. "You've spent too long thinking you can manipulate people into doing what you want," she continued. "But this ends here." My dad stormed out of the room, followed by my mom. The rest of the gathering was awkward, but I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, someone in the family had stood up to them in a way I couldn't. It was validating, even if the situation was far from resolved. Over the next few weeks, things started to settle down. My inheritance was finally secured, and my dad's siblings made it clear that they wouldn't tolerate any more interference. But the damage to my relationship with my parents felt permanent. They barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was only to remind me of how disappointed they were. It hurt, but I knew I couldn't let their disapproval define me anymore. For the first time in my life, I was standing on my own, and that was worth everything. The weeks following the family gathering felt strangely quiet, as if the dust was finally starting to settle. My parents stopped trying to contact me, which I thought would feel like relief. Instead, it felt hollow, like a silence that reminded me of how fractured things had become. I kept telling myself I had done the right thing, but there were still moments when doubt crept in. Did standing up for myself mean I'd lost my family for good? Grandma, of course, was my rock through all of it. She called often to check in, always quick to remind me that this wasn't my fault. Your parents made their choices, she said during one of our conversations. And so did you. But yours were the right ones. Her words helped, but the sting of being essentially disowned by my parents wasn't something that could be soothed easily. Surprisingly, Sophie started reaching out more. At first, I thought she was just checking in because our parents asked her to, but it quickly became clear that wasn't the case. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking since the inheritance drama started, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely reflective about the role she played in our family dynamic. I guess I just never questioned it, she said during one of our phone calls. Mom and Dad always made me feel like everything was fine, so I didn't really notice how unfair things were to you. Her words caught me off guard. Sophie had spent most of her life either ignoring or benefiting from our parents' favoritism, and I'd resigned myself to thinking she would never see it for what it was. But now, there was a vulnerability in her voice that felt new, as if she was finally starting to peel back the layers of their influence. We started meeting up regularly, usually for coffee or lunch. At first, the conversations were a little awkward. We were still untangling years of resentment and misunderstanding. But slowly, we began to open up to each other. Sophie admitted that she'd felt trapped by our parents' constant coddling, like they didn't trust her to make her own decisions. I know it probably looked like I had it easy, she said, but I never felt like I could fail. They wouldn't let me. I hadn't thought about it from her perspective before. I'd always assumed she was perfectly content being the golden child, soaking up all the attention and perks that came with it. But hearing her talk about how suffocating it had been made me realize that we were both victims of the same dynamic, just in different ways. Sophie told me she'd been thinking about using her share of the inheritance to go back to school. I want to do something meaningful, she said. I've spent so much time letting Mom and Dad make decisions for me, and I think it's time I figured out what I want for myself. I was proud of her, but I also couldn't help feeling a little bitter. Part of me wanted to say, where was this energy when I needed your support? But I knew that wouldn't help either of us move forward. Instead, I told her how happy I was that she was starting to take control of her life. It felt good to encourage her, even if a small part of me wished she'd come to these realizations years earlier. As Sophie began making changes in her life, our parents' reaction was predictably dramatic. When she told them she was enrolling in community college, they accused her of being influenced by me. You're just doing this to prove a point, my dad said, his voice dripping with disappointment. My mom, as usual, started crying, saying Sophie was abandoning the family by moving out and focusing on school instead of staying home to help them. Sophie confided in me that their reaction made her feel guilty, but she also knew she couldn't let them hold her back anymore. I've spent my whole life trying to make them happy, she said, but it's never enough, and I don't want to waste any more time. Hearing her say that was bittersweet. I hated that it had taken so much conflict for her to see the truth, but I was glad she was finally standing up for herself. Meanwhile, I was finding my own way forward. With my inheritance finally secure, I started thinking seriously about my next steps. I'd been volunteering at a local community center, working with young adults who had complicated family dynamics, and it was the first time in years I felt like I was doing something that truly mattered. Helping others navigate their own struggles gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I was missing. I decided to invest part of my inheritance into returning to school. I wanted to pursue a degree in counseling, focusing on family relationships and emotional neglect. It felt like the perfect way to take everything I'd been through and turn it into something positive. For so long, I'd felt like the black sheep of my family, like nothing I did would ever matter to them. But now, I was finally starting to see my worth beyond their approval. Sophie and I started leaning on each other more as we navigated our respective paths. We still had plenty of hard conversations about the past, but those talks became less about blame and more about understanding. We were rebuilding something that had been broken for years, and while it wasn't easy, it felt worth it. Our parents, however, weren't making the same progress. My dad's bitterness seemed to grow with every decision Sophie and I made. He started making veiled threats, like saying he might sell the family home just to teach us a lesson. My mom was slightly more conciliatory, but her apologies always felt surface level, like she was trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the root of the problem. Despite the challenges, I felt like I was finally starting to move forward. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I was simply living for myself. And while the road was far from easy, it was mine, and that made all the difference. The months passed, and despite the lingering tension with our parents, I started feeling more at peace with my life. Sophie and I continued to rebuild our relationship, and I couldn't help but feel proud of how far she had come. The more we talked about our past, the more we realized how much we had been shaped by the same toxic dynamic, though in different ways. The difference now was that we were choosing to break free from it. Sophie had thrown herself into her studies, and it was clear she was starting to find her confidence. I hadn't seen her so focused and determined in years. She even started working part-time at a nonprofit, something that made her feel like she was finally contributing to something bigger than herself. We met for coffee one morning, and she told me she was thinking about transferring to a 4-year university after completing her associate's degree. "I've been doing some soul-searching," she said, sipping her coffee, "and I think I want to work in social services. I've always wanted to help people, and I think this is the way I'm supposed to do it." I was thrilled for her, but I also couldn't help feeling a pang of jealousy. I'd spent years feeling invisible in our family, my efforts overshadowed by Sophie's needs, and here she was finally finding her purpose. The bitterness was fleeting, but it was still there, a reminder of everything I'd been denied. Still, I couldn't help but feel happy for her. She was finally standing on her own 2 feet, and that was something to be proud of. As for me, I was diving headfirst into my own future. I enrolled in the counseling program at a local university, determined to make something of myself beyond the shadow of my family's expectations. I started working part-time at a therapy clinic, helping people with family issues, and I loved it. It felt like I was finally on the path I had always wanted to be on. It was fulfilling, and every day I spent helping others, I felt a little more whole. However, things weren't entirely smooth sailing. There were still those moments when I thought about my parents, how they had dismissed me for so many years, how they tried to manipulate me into giving away my inheritance. I would sometimes catch myself thinking about the family gatherings I used to attend, the holidays that felt hollow, the absence of any real connection with them. I tried not to let it consume me, but the pain of it all lingered, and I often found myself grappling with what felt like an unhealed wound. Then one day, out of the blue, my mom called. I almost didn't pick up. After everything that had happened, I'd convinced myself that I was done with them, that their apology would never be enough to undo the years of hurt. But something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe a desire for closure, made me answer. "Alex," she said, her voice shaky. "I know we haven't talked in a while, but I've been doing a lot of thinking." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to let her off the hook too easily. After all, she had been a part of the problem for so long. "I've been seeing a therapist," she continued, "and I realize now how much I've hurt you, how much I've failed you and Sophie. I've been selfish, and I've put my own needs before yours for too long. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to change." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, processing everything she had just said. She wasn't begging for forgiveness, but she was admitting to the things I'd been wanting her to admit for years. There was no dramatic apology, no promise to make things right, just a small, genuine attempt at owning her part in the dysfunction. And in that moment, it felt like a tiny but significant step forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Mom," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "But I hear you, and I'm glad you're starting to see things for what they were." She sighed in relief. "I know it's going to take time. I'm sorry, Alex, for everything." I sat there in silence for a while, unsure of how to process it. I didn't have the answers, but something had shifted. There was no magic fix, no immediate reconciliation, but for the first time, I felt like she saw me, not as the one who was supposed to be the perfect child or the one who was always good, but as someone who had been hurt by her choices. That was the first step, and maybe that was all I needed to hear. The next few weeks were filled with long, difficult conversations. My mom started calling more often, though it was clear she was still learning how to navigate this new dynamic. I wasn't rushing to repair things, but I also wasn't shutting her out completely. She had a long way to go, but for the first time, I felt like there was potential for change. Sophie, too, was starting to distance herself from our parents. The more she grew into herself, the more she realized how controlling they had been over her life. When she told me she was planning to move to a new city for school, I was both excited and sad. It felt like a new chapter for her, but it also meant she would be even farther away from me, and from the family that had caused us so much pain. "I'm finally doing something for me," she told me one night as we sat on the porch, the evening air cool and calm. "And it feels good. I can't keep letting them dictate my life. I need to be on my own for a while." I was proud of her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to compete for attention. We were both finally stepping into our own lives, independent of the roles our parents had forced on us. But even as I celebrated Sophie's progress and continued to forge my own path, the reality of our parents' ongoing silence still weighed on me. There were moments when I wished things could be different, that we could all sit around the dinner table like a normal family, without the tension or the years of unspoken resentment. But I knew that wasn't the life we were living anymore. The years of favoritism had created wounds that might never heal completely, and while I was learning to live without their approval, I still wondered if I would ever stop craving the validation I had never gotten from them. At the end of the day, though, I had to accept that it was their choice to keep their distance. They had chosen their path, and I had chosen mine. And as painful as that reality was, I knew I was finally free to live my life the way I wanted, without the shadow of their expectations hanging over me. As Sophie settled into her new life, I could see her becoming someone I hadn't known before. Someone confident, independent, and, most importantly, happy. She had enrolled in community college, picked up a part-time job on campus, and was starting to build a life that was hers, not something scripted by our parents. It was incredible to watch, though I couldn't deny there were moments of bitterness that crept in. I wondered why it had taken her this long to see the dynamic for what it was, but I tried to remind myself that we were both products of the same environment. The blame didn't lie with her. Our parents, however, seemed to be taking her growth as a personal attack. My dad in particular couldn't stand the idea that she was doing something I had supported. To him, Sophie going back to school wasn't a sign of her independence. It was a sign that I had brainwashed her. He started dropping comments to the rest of the family about how Sophie was throwing her future away by taking on student loans and working at a dead-end job. It was infuriating because I knew he didn't really care about her finances. He cared about losing control. My mom, as usual, played the role of the heartbroken mediator. She called me one evening, her voice heavy with emotion, and said, "I just don't understand why you two are doing this to us. Your father is so hurt, Alex. He feels like he's lost both of his children." That comment lit a fire in me. "He didn't lose us," I said. "He pushed us away. And instead of reflecting on why that happened, you're both doubling down on the same behavior that got us here in the first place." She sighed, but it didn't sound like defeat. It sounded like someone who wasn't ready to let go of their version of the story. "We've always done what we thought was best for you," she said. If that wasn't enough, I don't know what else to say. It was a classic move, an attempt to shift the blame without actually taking responsibility. I decided I wasn't going to keep having the same circular conversations with her. "Maybe it's time you figure that out," I said before ending the call. It wasn't satisfying, but it was necessary. I couldn't keep letting them drag me into their guilt games. Meanwhile, Sophie and I were finding ways to rebuild our relationship. Our monthly coffee meetups turned into something I genuinely looked forward to. We'd sit for hours, talking about everything from childhood memories to the stress of navigating our new lives. One time, she admitted she felt guilty for how things had played out between us growing up. "I didn't realize how much I was taking for granted," she said. "And honestly, I feel like I let you down." Her honesty caught me off guard. I told her that while it had been hard to deal with, I didn't blame her for the way our parents treated us differently. "It wasn't your fault," I said. We were both just doing what we had to do to survive in that environment. We didn't solve all our issues in one conversation, but it felt like a turning point. For so long, I had seen Sophie as a reminder of everything I didn't have: the attention, the praise, the unconditional support. Now, I was starting to see her as someone who had struggled too, just in a different way. Around this time, I also started to notice how much more fulfilling my life felt. I had finally taken the leap and enrolled in a master's program to become a family therapist. The decision had been terrifying at first. I was stepping into a completely new field after years of working in tech, but the more I learned, the more certain I became that this was the right path. Volunteering at the community center had given me a taste of what it felt like to help others navigate their family challenges, and now I was ready to make it my career. The most surprising part was how much healing I found in helping others. Hearing other people's stories reminded me that I wasn't alone, that so many people struggled with family dynamics that left them feeling invisible or unloved. It also gave me perspective. My parents' actions had hurt me deeply, but I was learning that their behavior wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that stemmed from their own unresolved issues. That didn't excuse it, but it helped me understand it in a way that allowed me to let go of some of my anger. Sophie was thriving too. She had decided to transfer to a 4-year university after finishing her associate's degree, something I never thought I'd see her do. Watching her grow into her independence was one of the most rewarding things I'd ever experienced. She even told me she wanted to pursue a career in social work, inspired by everything she had been through and the changes she was making in her own life. "I just want to help people who feel stuck," she said. Like I did. Our parents, predictably, weren't thrilled. My dad barely spoke to Sophie anymore, and when he did, it was usually to make some passive-aggressive comment about her wasting her potential. My mom vacillated between trying to guilt her into quitting school and pretending to be supportive, depending on the day. Sophie told me it was exhausting, but she was learning to set boundaries with them. "I can't keep letting them control how I feel about myself," she said. Hearing her say that made me realize how far we'd both come. The rest of the family had started to adjust to the new dynamics as well. My dad's siblings and a few of my cousins were incredibly supportive, often reaching out to check in on both Sophie and me. Others, however, still clung to the idea that we were the ones causing the rift in the family. One cousin even told me, "It's sad to see how divided things have gotten. Don't you think it's time to just make peace?" Making peace sounded nice in theory, but I knew it would mean going back to the way things were, and I couldn't do that. Neither could Sophie. For the first time in our lives, we were finally putting ourselves first, and while it was messy and painful, it was also freeing. We were learning to define our own worth, not by our parents' approval, but by our own standards. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Sometimes I'd think about the family dinners we used to have or the rare occasions when my dad would give me a genuine compliment, and I'd feel a pang of longing for something I knew wasn't real. But those moments were becoming less frequent. More and more, I was focused on the life I was building and the person I was becoming. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly in control of my future. And as I watched Sophie blossom into her own person, I knew we were breaking a cycle that had defined our family for too long. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The final chapter of this whole saga came in a way I didn't expect. Sophie was getting ready to move for her transfer to a university in Portland, and we decided to have one last dinner together before she left. We'd been doing so well, reconnecting, rebuilding our relationship, and I felt like we'd finally reached a place where we could trust each other again. Over dinner, Sophie said something that hit me hard. "I've been thinking a lot about what we went through," she said, stirring her drink. "I don't think they'll ever change, and I don't think I'll ever fully forgive them for the way they treated us. But I don't want them to keep holding space in my head, you know?" I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. For years, my parents' favoritism, their manipulation, their dismissiveness, it had all lived rent-free in my mind. Every decision I'd made had been influenced by this need to prove myself, to be seen. But now, as I looked at Sophie, who was finally stepping into her independence, I realized she was right. We couldn't change them. The only thing we could change was how much power we let them have over our lives. That realization hit even harder a week later when my mom called. asking if Sophie and I could come over for dinner. She said she wanted to talk things out. Sophie and I hesitated. Neither of us trusted that this wasn't just another guilt-laden performance. But in the end, we agreed. Maybe part of us still hoped for closure. Or maybe we were just tired of running from it. When we arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. My dad was silent, arms crossed, his expression stony. My mom was trying to play the peacemaker, but it was obvious she was nervous. We sat down at the table, and for the first few minutes, it was just awkward small talk. Finally, my mom sighed and broke the silence. "I want us to fix this," she said, looking between Sophie and me. "I know we've made mistakes. I know I've made mistakes. But I don't want this to be how our family ends." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I could tell she meant them, at least partially. But before I could respond, my dad spoke up. "Mistakes? That's what we're calling it now," he said bitterly. "They're the ones who turned their backs on us, and we're just supposed to pretend like it's fine?" Sophie stiffened beside me. I could feel her temper rising, and honestly, I was right there with her. But I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. "We didn't turn our backs on you," I said evenly. "We stood up for ourselves. There's a difference." My dad scoffed. "You've always been ungrateful, Alex. Always looking for a reason to make us the bad guys." That was it. Years of pent-up frustration spilled out before I could stop it. Ungrateful? I spent my entire life trying to make you proud, and you never once saw me. Everything I did, everything I achieved, it was never enough for you because you were too busy worshiping Sophie. And now that she's finally standing up for herself, you can't handle that either. The room went silent. My mom looked like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Sophie, however, wasn't done. "You made me feel like I couldn't do anything without you," she said, her voice shaking. "And when I finally tried to take control of my own life, you called me selfish. Do you even hear yourselves?" For a moment, I thought maybe something would click for them, that they'd finally understand the damage they'd done. But my dad just shook his head. "You've both been brainwashed," he muttered. "This isn't who you are." Sophie stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "No, Dad," she said firmly. "This is who we are. And for once, we're not going to let you make us feel guilty about it." I followed her lead, standing up and looking directly at my parents. "We've tried," I said. "We've given you chance after chance to meet us halfway. But if all you can do is blame us, then maybe it's time we stop trying." We walked out together, and this time, I didn't feel the usual pang of guilt. I felt free. For years, I had clung to the hope that they would change, that they would see me and Sophie for who we really were. But now I realized that their inability to change didn't have to hold me back. Sophie left for Portland the next week, and I threw myself into my counseling program. Life didn't magically become perfect, but for the first time, I felt like I was living for myself and not for anyone else's approval. Sophie and I stayed close, calling each other regularly and sharing updates about our lives. We started a tradition of visiting each other once a month, and those visits became a reminder of how far we'd come. As for my parents, I heard from them less and less. My mom occasionally sent texts, mostly surface-level updates or half-hearted attempts to reconnect. My dad didn't reach out at all, and while that used to hurt, I found that I cared less and less as time went on. I had my own life now, a life I was proud of. And for the first time, I didn't need their validation to feel like I was enough. Breaking away from them wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of it all crept back in. But I had built something stronger than the approval I'd spent my life chasing. I had Sophie. I had my career. I had myself. And that was more than enough.